Next we have a newfound friend of mine, Curtis Hill, who's the former Attorney General from, what state is that? Somewhere over there, Indiana, I think it is. They call it the Hoosier State. He, he was, 2016 to 2020, I believe it was. And he was, at the time, the number one vote getter in history of elections, over 1.6 million votes. I think he told me yesterday that that's been passed now. We won't hold that against you. We'll still let you speak. He's going to be talking about, access to, voter access today. Probably in Indiana and Wisconsin and maybe a few other places.
Thank you, Dr. Wallace. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to be here, particularly as I understand that the Illinois State Legislature is working on greater efficiencies in Illinois elections. It's my understanding that they're looking to, by statute, make sure that every cemetery in the state of Illinois has its own voter precinct. But and since you did pick on Indiana a little bit, I am from Indiana, and one of the things that I'm always aware of, we would say to folks from Illinois, if you get Illinois'd, come to Indiana. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here. I want to start out by saying that in a free society, there are few things more important than the right to vote. And we saw some information on the screen previously about our founding fathers, and we're familiar with the words of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And most people think that's the most important aspect of the Declaration. But as we go on, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the consent of the governed, because the document goes on to say that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men to do what? To secure these rights. Governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Consent of the governed. What that means is that each of us, you and I, are free to do anything we want. God has given us our freedom, but we all voluntarily, as a part of our social compact as Americans, give up a piece of our freedom collectively to provide for the greater good. And that freedom we give up is our consent to create a government that secures our freedom, that secures our rights. So we, the people, do this how? We do it by voting. We throw a proposition up in the air and we say, well, how do we decide this? We're going to vote on it, and we're going to decide among ourselves. So by voting, we empower our government and our officials to manage our own affairs. In voting, we voluntarily grant authority for our safety, our family, our property, and our very freedom. And like many areas of today's modern culture, elections and access to voting have become increasingly controversial and bitter. Access to voting is now the subject of considerable dispute in our nation as our nation grapples with the proper balance between making it easy to vote and hard to cheat. Cheating. Now, come on, we don't cheat in elections, do we? Does anybody know anybody who's ever cheated in an election? Both of our major political parties are honorable institutions, motivated by freedom and equality, right? Republicans want everyone to vote. Democrats want everyone to vote. Free and fair elections, one person, one vote. Make every vote count. That's the standard that we're all familiar with. But ladies and gentlemen, the reality is both parties want to win. Officially, both parties will bend the rules as far as they can to secure an advantage. Unofficially, more sinister elements are at work, purposely exploiting loopholes or carefully crafting false narratives to incite anger or to spur allegations of suppression. Officially, both parties encourage all Americans to exercise their right to vote, so long as they're winning. But if winning is in doubt, you can bet that multiple thumbs will be applied to multiple scales with an effort to tip the balance and leave no fingerprints. And to be sure, there's nothing wrong with working to get more of your voters out than the other side, so long as it's fair and equal. Today I've been invited to talk about the current state of voter access, or put another way, how hard is it to vote? And in a very real sense, my talk should be quite short, because the truth of the matter is, it's not that tough. It's not that hard to vote. Now, some people think that it should be, I'm not going to vote unless you drop it off at my house in the mail. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing about voting that was intended to make it without some degree of effort. Certainly those who came before us and fought and died to preserve the opportunity and the right to vote would recognize that. But we do have to deal with those who think that it should be much easier. The fact is, it's so easy to vote that typically, once you get past the line, it takes about 5 minutes to get it done, provided that you know what you're doing, have researched who you want to vote for. But easy to vote has nothing to do with whether it's a hard effort or not. What about the assertion by Democrats that access to the polls by black voters in particular are intentionally suppressed by legislative maneuvers in the various states? Well, by way of background, let me first say this. Most people believe that voting is a fundamental right, meaning no restrictions whatsoever. You're born with the opportunity, with the right to vote. Well, that's just not true. While voting is a right, and perhaps a fundamental right, it's a fundamental right with conditions. So what are these conditions, and are they necessary, or are they an excuse to suppress others from exercising their right? Well, let's say that you're a foreign national living in America, not a citizen. Guess what? You don't get to vote. You do not have a right to vote if you're not a citizen. So citizenship itself is a restriction on that fundamental right. Or suppose you're under the age of 18. We collectively have made the determination as a nation that youngsters do not yet possess the requisite skills, notwithstanding some have a rather broad civil understanding, but youngsters don't possess the necessary maturity and skill set under the age of 18 to vote. So we limit voting to those who are 18 and older. Again, eligibility based upon a restriction. And then there's the issue of residency. So if I don't live in the state of Illinois, I can't vote in the state of Illinois. Well, maybe Illinois is not a good example. Let's go back next door to Indiana. Let's say if I live in Indiana, I should vote in Indiana. And in Indiana, contrary to Illinois, we vote once for one candidate at a time. So voting is a fundamental right, provided certain qualifying conditions of the voter are met. But voting is more than simply a right, for a fundamental right. It's also a choice. And while one certainly has a right to vote, it's a matter of personal choice whether one chooses to vote. And that's very important because we do have sometimes low turnouts, and there are people who just don't care about what's going on. Personally, I'm not interested in someone who doesn't care about the election or who hasn't researched the election going in and mucking up with my election. I think we need to make sure that people who are engaged in the process, have educated themselves in the process, have every opportunity to vote in that process. But there are some out there who want to take advantage of the ill-informed and rack up the numbers just with a body count. Is that cheating? Is that an advantaged loophole? By all accounts today in 2022, anyone who is qualified to vote and wants to vote has little beyond their own self-initiative to keep from voting, whether on election day, whether through early voting, absentee voting, or heaven forbid, mail-in ballots. There is virtually no excuse for any qualified individual wanting to vote not to vote. As everyone knows, That's not always been the case, without getting into an extensive history, as Mrs. Wallace has provided us with a background on voting in America. We have come a long way. And yet there's an extraordinary narrative in this country that nearly 60 years following passage of the Voting Rights Act, that many Republican-controlled state legislatures are enacting legislation specifically designed to suppress and unfairly restrict voter access, particularly black voters, from voting. These criticisms are vast and rely upon a false premise that black voters are being intimidated and systematically denied access to the vote. Probably the best example of this is the state of Georgia. Following the 2020 elections, the state of Georgia began to enact reform in its practices. And part of that reform was voter ID. It's, in fact, let me pull it up here. Yeah, they also wanted to prohibit these really awful things of handing out inducements like bottles of water. Now, that becomes kind of a humorous thing, because I can tell you that when I go to vote, I don't do so because I'm getting a bottle of water. But this has been made a big deal to suggest that in particular, black people won't vote unless you provide them with a bottle of water. I think that's a little silly. I almost don't want to talk about it, but ladies and gentlemen, it's out there. So we need to talk about it and address it. The other thing that I find interesting is the voter ID situation. Now, being from Indiana, that's a particular interest to me, because Indiana was the first state to adopt a photographic ID as a requirement for voting. And that was done back in 2005, and it never dawned on me that I have been a victim of racism because the keeper of the poll book has asked me for my ID. Never dawned on me at all. Photo ID legislation made sense then. It makes sense now, inasmuch as everyone has a government-issued identification already. I would say virtually 99% of the people do. So we're not talking about something that requires one to go out and pick up. And the other thing that's wonderful about the photo ID is, what did we talk about on those restrictions? Citizenship, age, residency. Boom. Pull out a card, and in seconds, someone can confirm someone's citizenship, age, and identity. I've heard others that say, well, we want to do it with, it's okay to just match signatures. My own signature changes all the time. It's crazy when I think about people verifying identification at a polling place based upon signatures. So the voter ID card makes so much sense. But maybe certain people don't want to confirm citizenship, residency, and true identity for particular reasons. Maybe they want greater scrutiny for another reason. The process in Indiana, which has been upheld by the United States Supreme Court, has served as a model for other states. It's provided those who show up with an ID to cast a provisional ballot, after which the voter is given 10 days in which to return to the polling site with proof of ID. So even if you don't have an ID, you can still vote provisionally and go get your ID and bring it back. There's also an additional fail-safe against arguments that securing ID would be overburdensome or too expensive, and that is that Indiana law requires that anyone needing a state identification card for purposes of voting can secure one, guess what? For free. Now, it only costs about $7 or something anyway, but just for argument's sake, you can get one for free. So they've taken all of the burden away from this process. The other states that are looking at, the other states that have adopted voter ID and those that are looking at voter ID are doing the same types of things. So we all would have to ask ourselves, are these barriers or burdens to voter suppression? The argument is so, I think, flimsy that it's not worth It's not worth talking about, but I'll talk about it anyway. First of all, there's nothing either in place nor contemplated that remotely resembles the Jim Crow era poll tax that required blacks to pay exorbitant amounts of money in order to purchase the opportunity to vote. The effect of the poll tax in the Jim Crow era was to turn blacks wanting to vote around and send them back home without having voted. Secondly, there is nothing in place now or in contemplation with these laws that are being contemplated, rather, that even remotely resembles setting blacks aside at the polling place locations and requiring them to pass a literacy test, which is by its nature designed to be impassable as a precondition to allowing them to vote. The effect of the literacy test, of course, was blacks would come down to vote and would be turned away and sent back home without voting. And of course, for several decades, the threat of violence in all forms, including lynching, had the effect of keeping blacks from coming to the polls at all. Insisting that a request for all voters to present an identification card that 99% of the voters have already secured for some other purpose is the same, insisting that that's the same as Jim Crow racism is a tactic that insults the ordinary sensibilities and the memories of those who suffered those demeaning atrocities against their freedom. The further insistence that the ID request is racist because it will disproportionately affect black voters insomuch as black voters are more likely than white voters to not have IDs leads me to ask this question: why is that? Why are black people more likely not to have government-issued photo IDs? Ladies and gentlemen, I've been black all my life. I know a lot of black people. I don't know a single black person that does not have a photo ID. They could be out there, maybe I don't know, but I don't know one. I don't know a single black person that doesn't have a photo ID. In fact, aside from voting, an adult of ordinary experience would be unable to function well in our society without maintaining a valid photo ID. And those who claim voter suppression should also complain about driving an automobile as being racist, because what does an automobile require? If you're going to drive a car, got to have a license, got to have a photo ID. Don't have that photo, that's racist. Without an ID, how do you open up a bank account? How do you do a credit application or order a cell phone or a cable bill or ordinary utilities? All would have racist implications daily rather than just on election day. Yet not a peep about blacks not able to get a cell phone or cable TV because they don't have an ID. In fact, those who suggest that blacks are much more likely to not have a government-issued ID are they themselves engaging, in my view, racist stereotyping that's not supported by any data. Now, while it's laudable and in fact desirable to make it easy to vote, and I would submit that it's quite easy to vote already, there is no requirement, nor should there be that voting require some minimal effort on the part of the voter. A reality is that the further away from election day we venture, the more vulnerable the election is. Vulnerable to irregularities, vulnerable to outright cheating, and therefore every move in the area of protecting elections should be a balance between reasonable access and opportunity to vote and securing and protecting the interest of the voter. Now, in recent years, early voting and no-excuse absentee ballots have increased under the guise of expanding voter access, and some states have moved or are moving toward an all-male voting system. And that's male as in U.S. male, not male as in guy. While these systems may be heralded for those who place a premium on ease of vote, they also present particular difficulties in providing a secure and fair election process. There are also several areas of concern regarding the vulnerability of the election process and therefore out-and-out cheating. One report sticks out as a monumental assault on fair elections. According to a publication or an article in the publication The Federalist, and I want to go over this with you a little bit, During the 2020 election, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg spent hundreds of millions of dollars to turn out likely Democratic voters, but this wasn't traditional political spending. He funded a targeted private takeover of government election operations by the Center for Technology and Civic Life and the Center for Election Innovation and Research, which passed a staggering $419 million of Zuckerberg's money into targeted local government election offices, and it came with strings attached. Every CTCL and CEIR grant, and these were grants through Zuckerberg money, spelled out in great detail the conditions under which the grant money was to be used. For example, the Wisconsin legislature provided $7 per voter for heavily Democrat Green Bay and $4 per voter in the rural parts of the state. According to the information from the Federalist, the CTCL funds, or the Zuckerberg money, boosted Democrat voting Green Bay resources to $47 per voter, while most rural areas still had the same $4 voter base. Similar funding disparities occurred near Detroit, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Flint, Dallas, Houston, and other cities that received tens of millions of dollars of these monies. The report in the Federalist concludes, the practical effect of these massive, privately manipulated elected office funding disparities was to create a shadow election system with a built-in structural bias that systematically favored Democratic voters over Republican voters. The massive influx of funds essentially created a high-powered, concierge-like get-out-the-vote effort that took place inside the election system rather than attempting to influence it from outside. See, that's the traditional place where private money goes, paying for advertisement and get-out-the-vote opportunities. Don't miss this point. This is private money from a multi-billionaire going into local elected operatives and making changes. And did you notice where these locations were? These locations were in particular areas, so you're going to get grant money in certain areas that vote a certain way and could provide additional official resources as compared to other areas that don't get those grants. We hear a lot of talk about whether elections have been stolen. There's no question that these elections have been bought. And this is something that we have to take a very good hard look at. According to the Federalist, the unprecedented merger of public election offices with private resources and the unprecedented merger of public election offices with private resources and personnel is an acute threat to our republic and should be the focus of electoral reform moving forward. So I ask you, is the private manipulation of our election processes by a multi-billionaire cheating? It's certainly more than a bottle of water. And what we have to start looking at are these exploitations of the rules, the out-and-out disregard for the rules, in recognizing our desire to make voting easy and accessible, but also secure. Making sure that all Americans understand the truth about elections is difficult. Why? The weaponization of race. That's always difficult. That's what one side does. Well, let's make it about race. I like to say, make it about black and they won't fight back. Accuse someone of being a racist and everybody pulls back. And that's what's happening with voter ID. We're making it about race. We're suggesting that voter ID is an attack on the civil rights movement. We have to stand strong on that and speak the truth. And the truth is, well, the weaponization of race is hurting our election process. The infusion of private fortunes into official responsibilities is hurting our process and needs to be addressed immediately. Hopefully, through forums such as this, we can generate the information and the truth necessary to arm our communities with the tools to ensure not only proper access to voting, but proper security as well. Thank you very much.